Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're so happy that you all could join us for this edition of the American West program. We had to go on hiatus for 2020 for obvious reasons, but we're so excited to be able to host you all again and gather our community together tonight. Before we get going here, I would like to invite Blue Moccasin Soldier Wolf up to the stage to deliver the CSU land acknowledgement.
Colorado State University acknowledges with respect that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. This was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for numerous other Native tribes. We recognize the Indigenous peoples as original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. CSU is founded as a land-grant institution, and we accept that our mission must encompass access to education and inclusion. And significantly, that our founding came at a dire cost to Native nations and people whose land the university was built upon. This acknowledgement is the education and inclusion we must practice in recognizing our institutional history, responsibility, and commitment.
Thank you so much, Blue.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to invite Dr. Jared Orsia to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Thanks. Welcome, everybody. Can you hear me through my mask? Okay, all right. So CSU policy is that even speakers wear masks. But we appreciate all of you being here this evening, both those of you who are able to be here in person, as well as the many of you who are joining us via Zoom. We have at least one person who's watching from out of state and maybe others. And I'd especially like to welcome the CSU History Department graduate student contingent who is tuning in to join us this evening. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to offer some thank yous. And as I've been preparing my remarks here this evening, I have the simultaneous fear that the thank yous are both going to go on too long and I'm going to leave somebody out. So I'm going to apologize for both of those things here now. First of all, Blue, thank you very much for reading our land acknowledgement. I would also like to thank Ariel Schnee. Ariel, I think can we all give Ariel a round of applause? So tonight would not have happened without Ariel. She has been supervising all of the activities, planning for this on the PLHC's end, at least, and it's taken an enormous amount of time, and so far it has come off really well. So thank you for all the hours and the expert planning and organization you've put in. I'd also like to thank Doreen Beard and the Avenir Museum who are hosting us this evening. And I'd like to thank Christy Ornelas and Corinne Neustatter, who are the Public Lands History Center students who have helped out planning this and are here tonight to make sure everything runs smoothly. The PLHC has a number of partners in making this event happen. And one of the most important of those is the Fort Collins Museum of Discovery. And I would like to thank all of the staff from the museum. And I'd especially like to recognize Cheryl Donaldson, Laura Valdez, Shannon Quist, Leslie Struck, Danielle Shields, and Linda, is it Miller? Moore. I'm sorry if I didn't write down your last name. You're on my list here, but I'd also like to thank Frank Boring, who's in the audience with us this evening, and Ed Warner, and who's in Africa and unable to join us tonight. From the history department, I'd like to thank for support of this and other programming. I'd like to thank Robert Goodmestad. And then I'd also like to thank Allison Pine, Sherry McElwain, and Jenna Milliman for all of the administrative support they give us for the history to make the PLHC work. Also, tonight's event is funded by the Henry Luce Foundation under a grant that we have to carry out programming like this, and we're grateful to our program officer, Sean Buffington. From the College of Liberal Arts, I'd like to thank Dean Ben Withers, Associate Dean Michael Carolon, and grant writer and budget maker extraordinaire Catherine Coleman Kane. And the Public Lands History Council is here tonight as well. I'd like to thank Ruth Alexander, Liesl Carr-Childers, Mike Childers, Christy Ornelas, Sarah Payne, Ariel Schnee, and Adam Thomas. And then finally, I would like to thank Yufna Soldier Wolf, tonight's speaker, who drove through the snow from Wyoming to be here with us this evening. And this is a typical example of the difference between Wyoming and Colorado weather that we're seeing here. Okay, all right, so as I promised, I went on too long, and I fear perhaps I left some people that I should thank out. But in any case, thanks to the many people who made tonight possible. So at the Public Lands History Center, we believe that land acknowledgement is a vital first step that in what needs to evolve eventually into land action. And as a historical organization, we attempt to take action on behalf of Indigenous peoples by making sure that Indigenous stories reach as wide an audience as possible. We have a number of projects collaborating with Indigenous groups, but I have to say that the one that has given me the most satisfaction and delight is our partnership of the last 2 years with Yufna Soldier Wolf and her family. I have to thank Frank again here because he's the one who introduced me to Yufna 2 years ago. And Yufna told me that day, she described an extraordinary collection of papers that her father had compiled over the years. And she said to me, she said, they have so many stories to tell, and I don't know what to do with them. And then so my ears perked up, Yufna, because what we do is help people who want to tell stories about history to have an audience and to tell those stories and make sure they're told well and in the way that the tellers want to make sure that they're told. So over the last couple of years, so Yufna came down to visit us again a couple weeks, I don't know, a month later or something like that. And at that time, I said, you know, we'd really like to invite you to come give a talk here at CSU in a few weeks or a few months. Well, that's turned into 2 years now, but we're very glad to be here. During that time, Frank and Ed and Yufna and I have been working with different museums and archives to try and find a good home for these papers. And last January, in a series of windstorms up in Wyoming, they don't call it the Wind River for nothing, blew part of the roof off the trailer where Yufna and her family had stored these papers. And so Yufna said, it's time for us to swing into action and stop talking and start finding a safe place for these papers. So Frank and Ed and I drove up there in a CSU van, and Yufna and her family welcomed us, and we were able to carry the papers back here to Fort Collins. And one of the things that Yufna said to me that really moved me was she described it as bringing them home. Northern Colorado is the home it has long been and always will be the home of the Northern Arapaho people. And so when these papers that deal with her family and her tribe came home to Fort Collins, we really felt like they were in a good place. So this is where Fort Collins Museum of Discovery comes in, because they have adopted these papers for a year. And they and Yufna are in the process of determining where the long-term home for them will be. But for the time being, I'm really glad that they're here in Northern Colorado. Yufna is an accomplished and wonderful person. She has been the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Northern Arapaho. She currently works for the Wyoming Outdoor Council, and she's tasked with bringing Indigenous narratives to Wyoming's Red Desert, which entails a lot of different things, from dealing with wild horses to solar power and energy, tours of the desert. But the most important thing to know about Yufna is that she is incredibly smart and warm and outgoing, and somebody that I'm very honored and privileged to have been able to collaborate with for the last 2 years. One of the most important things that I think she's done professionally and personally is to work hard to bring the remains of children who died at the Carlisle Indian boarding school back home to the Wind River Reservation. And that's what she'll be talking to you about this evening. So I'm glad to share with you this evening Yufna Soldier Wolf, and I'd like you to join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Jared. I appreciate it. So where is Ariel? Okay, so I just push on the, it's okay if the screen goes away. And we get pretty used to being on Zoom these days. We'll see if it stops. Okay, so thank you, Jared. I appreciate the introduction. Those SE Nediana Nanana Yufna Soldier Wolf, Nanana Hanana Nade, Nanana Hanana Issa. What I said is hello, all my relatives. My name is Yufna Soldier Wolf. I'm Northern Arapaho, and my Arapaho name is Arapaho Chef. What I'll talk to you today about is one of the projects I've worked on. And one of the reasons why it's really important to talk about is we're losing the Indigenous female stories from my tribe. And one of the jobs I have is to bring those stories back into society. And for too long, those stories have been suppressed and they have been nearly forgotten. And so in this way, I stand here because I feel like I'm a messenger a lot of the times. And one of the things that my dad had done was he was a historian for my tribe, and he lived to be 90 years old. He passed away 2 years ago. And through this paperwork he had was this huge archive of stuff, right? And growing up, it was like, oh, pictures. I don't know if you guys saw the pictures that were generating going through. That's just like 2% of what we have at the museum. And so getting them here has been a huge job. But one of his goals was like, you need to do something with this. So I grew up really traditional. My mom is 84. She turned 84 like 2 weeks ago. And so I'm the youngest of 10 children. And one of the things with them was learning up culturally, participate in our ceremonies, our social dances, know how to bead, know how to sew. And so I had that opportunity to grow up in that aspect. And a lot of our young people today don't. They've lost a lot. So I'll talk about historical trauma later. But I kind of want to set that foundation. All of this paperwork that came here, I would not have been able to do the research that I did to repatriate the children from Carlisle if I didn't have any of my dad's stories, and I didn't grow up the way I did, and my dad didn't have any of this research. And so going forward and really talking about the Arapaho in Carlisle, I'll get into that, and I think we're having questions and answers after, but if you really have a need to ask something, I'm more than open to that. One of the things I'm always asked about is who are the Arapaho, and we were migratory people. We have creation stories that go back thousands of years, and it is said that we migrated here to Colorado. We came here from the Great Lakes region, and we have an Algonquin language, and so thousands of years ago, we evolved through various states they weren't states at that time, but various locations where eventually we have this vast location. When we talk about stories from the Rocky Mountains to the Mississippi to Texas to Canada, there's so many linguistic connections. There's so many creation stories that we share with other tribes. So you see those things that are really evident. One thing that's really important to me that I really like to promote is the ecology of that migration throughout the evolution of my tribe. And it's really important because of the things we make and the things that we had, and it wasn't just through a trade system. And so when I talk about that, we take into consideration the dyes that we needed from the plants to make various dyes, certain coils, certain type of beadwork that we had, certain type of animals we used for different shelters or clothing, it was all there. So when you listen to these oral histories and these stories, for me, it's huge because I have this huge imagination, right? And my dad used to tell, he was a historian, right? He was a storyteller. So I would sit there and this was before cell phones, right? So I was enthralled in all the things that he had to say. And so that's part of what I'm bringing to you today and talking about the Arapaho and who we were and moving forward. Throughout that thousands of years, we made it to Colorado, and then politically, we end up in Wyoming. And I'll kind of talk about going forward. And it's really important to understand that prior to settling on the Wind River Reservation, we had our own political system. We had our own political hierarchy, and it wasn't what it is today. And still today, we haven't adopted the Indian Reorganization Act from the 1930s. And one of those constructions that the government had organized was that each tribe was going to decide to adopt their own constitution, their own bylaws, and through that, that's how they would set up their businesses, their healthcare, their education. We decided we didn't want to do that. We were going to stay in traditional government. And what that meant was our elders, our older people, were going to be the leaders of our tribe. We were still going to have a political organization who ran our day-to-day business, and that's the way we are today. We have resolutions that basically are our standing orders, but we don't go by a constitution. And that's really important to understand because as I go forward, we're going to talk about negotiations. So where did this start, right? We learn early in college or in high school about manifest destiny, the land grab, encroaching settlers, small Indian wars and battles. And lastly, the biggest battle for us was the Little Bighorn, greasy grass. We call it Battle of Little Sheep Creek. And so within this time, 1876, prior to that, the Arapaho and Cheyenne were massacred here in Colorado. And politically, we aligned ourselves with the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota. And out of those three alliances, they say it was planned, we're gonna be ready to protect ourselves and our children and our kids. So after 1867 massacre here in Colorado, it ended up being that we fought again in Montana, Custer's last stand. And so those stories and those narratives are being left out. You don't hear about any of the Indigenous stories. And if you do, it was just one tribe was there, or, you know, you just hear the colonial patriarchal narratives. You never hear of the other tribes. And one thing about my father was he really empowered the women in our family and our tribe, because we used to be a matriarchal family, a matriarchal tribe. And we were matriarchal because the buffalo are matriarchal. And we learned that system through the animals. And so understanding that is also important. So one thing with Custer's last stand was, you know, it put us in this real political system of what's going to happen to the Arapaho, what's going to happen to the Cheyenne. And so in 1878, we failed negotiations to get our own reservation. And in that time, Congress was actually making executive orders for various tribes to get reservation land. And it was a huge process, because one thing they did say, and they lumped us in together, the Arapaho with the Sioux at that time. And so at that time, they said the Arapaho, the Sioux are not going to receive their own reservation. And so politically, it put us in a weird position. And one of the things that we ended up having to do was we were forced to settle on the Wind River Reservation in 1878. And for to do that, we had to politically sell our lands here in Colorado and use that funding to pay for the land in our own reservation on the Wind River Reservation. And politically, that puts both tribes, because there's this tribe there now, Eastern Shoshone, and the Eastern Shoshone historically are getting land ceded at that time too. Slowly and slowly, the land is diminishing because of railroads, because of various things. And so when we talk about boarding schools, I always get that question of why were our children sent to boarding school? Well, that's why. There was a huge land grab, there was a railroad, all of these different settlers were coming in. And so we're talking about how and why these children were taken. And this picture here is in 1881. And what had happened here was the two children, I don't know if I can point them out, the two children with the hats are Eastern Shoshone and the rest are Northern Arapaho. And most of these children were children of war chiefs. And it just so happened at this time somebody took a picture. And growing up, while I was a really young girl, we would go visit different relatives, and I would hear them cry. I would hear them I would be real afraid to go visit people, because I was like, it's going to start out real good, and then we're going to start crying. And I was like, why are they crying? I didn't understand why they were crying until I was like in 7th grade. And I realized that generation were the ones that actually went off to boarding school. And so we start talking about the unauthorization of taking these children. And we talk about how they were, a lot of the elders viewed it as they're hostages of the government. If we take their children away, the war chiefs will have to do what we tell them to do. And so for me, my direct relative is, maybe I can see. He's right here. His name is Little Chief. And he is, his father and his mother were Sweetgrass. The pictures that we're going through, those are my family. Those were his direct parents. And so one of the things that had happened was what happened once they got there. So he saw them as they left, and then once they got there, everything changed for them. My dad was a part of that boarding school era. This was actually my dad's uncle that went to Carlisle, and he passed away there. And so he had a younger brother who was my dad's father, who also went to Carlisle. He actually graduated in 1912. All of this record and research now sits at the Fort Collins Museum. Their diplomas, their photos, all of this is there. So when we talk about trauma, we talk about it wasn't a welcoming type of experience when we got there. When we went to go to Carlisle, it was really an experience. And it was emotional. It was hard to wrap your head around sending a 3-year-old child on the train. And it wasn't a luxury train, it was a cattle cart. And they drove all the way from here to Pennsylvania. And so when you think about that and you hear these stories about our tribe, I finally understood that's why they were crying. That's why my relatives were crying growing up. And so hearing those stories finally start clicking when I was in high school. And I was like, why did nobody ever bring these children home? Why, has nobody done anything about it? So 1881 was a long time ago, right? But my dad and his brothers and his dad, when he went to Carlisle, he came back. He actually graduated. He's a survivor of boarding school. And when he came back, he was the youngest business councilman for like 25 years because he could read, he could write, he could negotiate with the government. And so his experience at Carlisle was exactly this, where they completely changed him, right? And he would talk about them cutting his hair, taking sacred items away from him, telling him he couldn't interact with his family when he got there, if they were there. And it was weird. I'll get into this next section of where they're talking about really just taking their culture. Richard Henry Pratt did this thing of kill the Indian, save the man. The weird research I had to pull away from this was how many children did we have at boarding school? Because let me talk about Indian names first. When you're born, you have one name. As you grow up, it might change. And we didn't have last names. We didn't have to pay taxes. We didn't need a social security card back then, right? And so when these children went, a lot of what they did was undocumented. Even how they died was undocumented. And so throughout that change, two brothers could go to Carlisle, like my relatives, and they both got 2 different last names, which doesn't make no sense, right? And so when we had to go back and do the research to claim these children, it was really hard to figure out, okay, who's who based upon the name they got when they were there. They had a little sister who also went, and I always say this was the first documentation of missing murdered Indigenous women, because a lot of children ran away at that time. And my great aunt ran away from Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and made it as far back as Bemidji, Minnesota. And as she grew up, she wrote a letter to her brother saying, I'm alive, I'm here, don't tell no one, I might get in trouble. And she's a grown woman at this time, I think it was in the 60s or 70s. And she still felt maybe she might be retaliated against this or punished. And at that time, a lot of Arapaho families were broken. When you send a child off and you don't have that responsibility of taking care of those children anymore, where does that put the parents? Where does that put the grandparents? So basically, they were breaking these communities and these family systems. So that is a part of intergenerational trauma. The children go off to school, they feel resentment, right? Like, why did my family not fight for me? Why am I doing this? Was I bad? What happened? They don't know. They don't even speak English. And so they get there, they go through this process, and then they're the war chiefs there figuring out how do we settle on this reservation. They're seeing life change. If they didn't send their children, they were punished. You got thrown in jail, your rations were kept from you, you didn't get any beef. So punishment was real harsh at that time when you're already malnutrition. You can't hunt the buffalo because the railroad took them out. So it's this systemic problem, right? And so today, we still see that. Growing up, I was like, why is it so stereotypical that as an Indigenous person, people think we're alcoholics, we're drug addicts, you know, we do live in poverty. And so I was like, what is wrong with this picture? Because I wasn't raised that way. You know, I was actually raised from my boarding school surviving parents to be proud of who I was. And so a lot of other kids didn't have that opportunity. And so today we still see those colonial impacts, and we band-aid those wounds with alcohol and drugs. And we band-aid those broken families through alcohol and drugs. And so all of these different horrific things that happen at boarding school still impact us today. And so that was a part of my process, was realizing this is happening. Why is nobody doing anything about it? So it became this repatriation project where I wouldn't let it go. Anytime I got the opportunity to talk about it, I would talk about it. But I had to heal myself because I knew I had grown up with family and friends who gone through these horrific things and didn't even know why. And so as we move forward, we had 3 of our own children. Like I said, Little Chief was the oldest son of Sharpnose, who was my great uncle, my great great grandpa. Little Plume, he was the oldest son of Killsbass. I don't know if you guys know Chief Friday. He has a lot of history here. And then Horse, oldest son of Eagleman. So these 3 little boys that passed away in Carlisle still have family. They still have relatives on the reservation. And so, like I said, pulling that information out was really tedious and hard. And so, as I grew up, I got this book from Fort Collins Museum, and it was a NAGPRA book. I think it was called Grave Injustices. And I just went through it and I was like, this is how we're going to get our kids back. And I was, I think, a junior in high school at that time. And I would go everywhere with my dad, drive him. I didn't have a driver's license. Drive him here and drive him home. And he was an older person, so I always had to help him. And people used to think he was my grandpa. And it was a time where I'd have to sit with older people and listen to them because I took my dad. I brought my dad, so they'd all sit there and visit. And finally, there, the elders were like, they have this law, let's get our kids back. And one thing that was really hard to do was to persuade my own tribe, but then to persuade the government to say, we want our children back. And these children right now, at that time, were in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It's considered a Army War College. And for the past 134 years, they were buried there. But throughout that time they were buried, the very first cemetery, they got disinterred and got put in the post-secondary cemetery. So they were already reburied a second time. And when we wanted them, it was documented. Dickinson College there has a digital resource center just within the last 2-3 years. But what I had to do was pull all this history from my elders and from my dad and just get it all together. And so one of the things that we finally had to prove, the man here is the Arlington Cemetery attorney and the 2 archaeologists. So I went to school for anthropology, and one of the things that I knew and I could hold them accountable for is this process, right? Section 106, NAGPRA and NAGPRA. And really going through that process was tedious. So we had these negotiations and saying, what does that look like? How are we going to transport these children back? How are we going to get there and bring these children back? It was a large project that I threw myself into because I wanted to, we need to heal as tribal people. And so all of these smaller things start coming in about how do we do this? How do we make it happen? The picture you see me holding the cards up, where I had to do a PowerPoint presentation to Arlington lawyers, right? Well, none of my technology worked. Everything shut down when it was time to talk to them and do my presentation. And the last thing I could think of was like, all right, I got these 3 children's pictures and I need to just have someone hold them up for me and I could talk. And so that's what I did. And eventually they said, okay, we don't have a process. We're the military. Even though they repatriate from other countries, they don't repatriate Native American human remains. And so I said, well, NAGPRA is and Section 106 are laws that we have to comply with. You guys also have to comply with your own laws. And I had to hold them accountable to that. And so getting up and having to talk and negotiate with them, I had to heal myself from all of this intergenerational trauma, right? All of this grieving, because I couldn't stand there and just cry and beg them, please, bring them back. I had to know what I was talking about. And so my whole education, my whole background, my whole experience kind of came from that. And finally they said, okay, let's repatriate. We'll figure out a process and we'll start to decide how we're going to do this. The picture here is Dr. Trimble. And as you see the small little cemetery here, it's so surreal when you see it like this. But when you walk in there, you realize these are children headstones. A lot of people say boarding schools are the only schools that have no playgrounds, but only cemeteries, and that's true. Here are all our chiefs. Here's Crawford, Nelson, Hubert, Friday, and my father. Crawford's passed away, and so has my father. They were actually able to see this come to fruition. They were actually able to see how we went through this whole process. And without them there, I probably would have lost my mind, honestly, because they grounded me. But we also took youth with us because it was important to say, our elders went through this process. Our young people need to learn from it, and they need to be that next generation of holding people accountable from doing and continuing this process. So these are pictures of me doing the reburial. I have a little trailer that I'll play, but I just wanted to take time to honor these three children, Little Chief, Horace, and Little Plume. So Horace, oldest son of Eagleman, buried as Horace Washington, born 1870, 1883. Little Plume, oldest son of Killed Last, Columbia Vanderbilt Friday, born 1869, passed away in 1883. Little Chief, oldest son of Sharpmouth, class 4 chief, born 1868, 1883. All of these children actually were a part of Custer's last stand. There's stories and documentation showing these children there, and especially Little Chief, because it was so highly documented at that time who was a part of it. There's stories of them running bullets and ammunition, holding horses, and it was this huge documented battle that, well, even if you go and try to pull that information today, that's hard. So we have a saying, we say, we admonish you never to forget what happened to our elders, our children, and our ancestors, what they had to endure for us to sit here today. Don't take that for granted. And I take that wholly, entirely personal, because, it becomes personal when you actually have to go to school and learn the things that we need to hold the government accountable for. And before I get into Q&A, I wanted to play, and that's if I can find it. I wanted to play a trailer. We actually made a film. I don't want to close this because I might. I wanted to play the trailer. You can find this if you Google Home from School. We're actually going to play the film here. I believe it's November 10th and 11th. And we recently finished this film. When I'll play the trailer, it's 5 minutes. But one of the things, one of the things about the film, like I said, was finally getting to that point of seeing our children come home. And we don't really get to see the academic side of it. I actually have a simulation I'll play after of the cemetery. But I'll play the trailer now, and then I'll do the simulation of the cemetery, and then we'll have questions.
Mother wants to admit all the horrible things that happened when it comes to children. grip blade of the scissors against my neck. Then I lost my spirit. Who you are isn't right. Let's take that savage nature away from you. The white man wanted you to learn his way. 100%. Our chiefs at the time, they were doing it as a way to bring the hope back to our people. And I don't think they ever thought they were sending children off to die. I want everybody to know what happened to our children in those boarding schools. I'm sure your kids. As I can feel the pain, I can heavy heart. You're buried back in the 1800s. You're too old. It's time for them to go home. You take that home. Stop. That's here for 20 years. I was like, why didn't they bring these kids home? Felt like weird feelings. Something wasn't done right. It was like the army was just thinking in their heels. All their arguments were, no. It's up to us to either find the truth ourselves or continue to pressure the government to bring that truth forward. My dad was like, you need to go, you need to carry this on until we finish it, he said. We're not waiting no longer for anybody to come save us. We're going to save ourselves.
So that's one of the trailers. If you go to Home from School, you can see what we have on there. There's other videos that we have below. It's going to keep playing. There's different segments also. And there's just different panel discussions we've done over the course of this time. One of the things that we really brought back to trying to heal from intergenerational trauma was the fact that a part of repatriation is just that. It's that it's the right to bring our own people home. It's the right to be able to rebury them. It's the right to do all these types of things that we were not given the right to do back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And it wasn't very far, and it hasn't been a very long time to understand what the Arapaho have endured, but who all these other tribes have gone through. When I first started this process, I thought it was only our tribe, right? And then I started getting all of our research in of reading about how many tribes were there and how many tribes have children there, and all of this different research where all these other tribes wanted their children home. And they continuously asked and asked. We were the first to get our kids back, and it was this huge thing, right? But at the same time, I myself was like, we need to do this to heal. I don't want to see my children or the children's children to go through this anymore, and to be a part of this systemic problem that we have on the reservation, that we are proud people and that we're still here. One of the things I'll show you really quick is the simulation, and I thought it was up here. I can't really see it anymore. Let's see. Okay. Sorry, I gotta find the simulation again. Yes, here it is. I'm trying to make it bigger. I just can't figure out. I don't know if you can see that, but this is the very first time, the post-secondary cemetery. And when we excavated the children, one of the processes was knowing that there was already research and somebody documented the second time they were reburied. And we knew ahead of time that one of the third kid's little plume wasn't where they say he was buried. And we went with the hopes of thinking like he's going to be there. So it turned out that the physical traits that this child had was not the same as little plume. So we had to go back the next year, and he was buried where the records say he was. Everything matched. And reburial is really a new thing to tribes. It's not something that we were traditionally have done practice. And so NAGPRA, this law has actually been this catalyst for tribes to be able to bring their children home, but it's also kind of put us in the position of having new tribal protocols and having new types of ways to do things so that we can get our children back, so we can get artifacts back. This was one repatriation that I did as the former triple. I've done other reburials here in Colorado and other places. And it just so happened this was the most famous, probably because of Jim Thorpe, probably because of the history of Carlisle. And so it became that we were making this documentary about it. And throughout the documentary, we had all of these other people who wanted to be a part of it. And it was tedious. It was hard. It was emotionally like I wasn't going to go and let my elders have emotional breakdowns while we were there. So we went through our own traditional practice and trainings through White Bison. And I had to make sure that if I take these elders that far, that they don't get sick, that they make it there and they come home and they have closure. So in one day, we had all 3 reburials. And if you know Wyoming, it's huge, right? Long distances. So in the end, each child had we call it their last ride. And each child has a rideless horse and they have a war bonnet on there. And so we paid, huge, homage to these children coming back. We welcomed them home. And after it was over, we were like, now comes the real work. Now comes the real work where we need to heal. And so a lot of that intergenerational trauma was induced from boarding schools, but we have the tools today to make sure that our younger people don't fall into that same cycle of abuse, and falling into those, using Band-Aids to, put off those little wounds of, the things that hurt them. And they don't realize that intergenerational traumas, we still feel that today. We still go through that today. And with me, I want to see, even in 5 years, I want to see a huge change with my people where we're healing, we're moving on, we're making things better. If it's through policy, that'd be great. And even if it's through education, I think that's even better. That's the best resource I think we have. Before I go any further, do we want to start taking questions, Ariel? Yeah, okay. I'm gonna turn this one off and then. I think we have questions on chat.
Yeah, how I'd like to run this. So folks are going to be putting in online questions on chat. Here, you can just raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone. So yeah, questions.
Okay. So do we have any questions? Yes.
Some of the global revolution undocumented I'm just wondering if there are other children involved, and I'm also really interested in what's happening in the United States in comparison to I'm sure they the treating reconciliation. What do you think is possible?
Okay, yes, so I'll repeat the question really quick was, where do we see ourselves in the United States in respect to residential school? And I think the first question was, how do we, missing children, how, and that's a good question because there are other children. So Carlisle was just the first boarding school. There are other current boarding schools in operation today. They're not like they were back then, but these current boarding schools like Haskell University, they have a cemetery there. So there were other children from our tribe that went to these various boarding schools. And as you all know, I don't know if you know, but Secretary of Interior has, put resources towards doing an investigation and finding out how many people how many tribes have sent other children in different places. I can tell you through Carlisle, documentation was really small. Trying to find out why a child died, we were so unimportant, they didn't really document any of that. They didn't talk about what types of ailments they have, they just had the date, who they were related to, and what they died. And so I'm assuming that a lot of other schools probably have the same documentation. And then with as far as Canada goes, is one thing, the difference is, so Carlisle was the first boarding school. We finally got to repatriate the human remains, our ancestors, our relatives, my relative. Canada didn't repatriate. They did settlements and did reparations. They paid their relatives for enduring what they went through. We have not done that here, and I don't think tribes are so humble, right? They'd rather heal than maybe get a payment. That's how I feel as a survivor. I feel like if we were to get those resources, I think it should go towards counseling. It should go towards tribal programs where we can move forward and heal from this. I don't see a payment coming to me that would benefit myself. And so there are those differences. I'm pretty sure Canada has their own reasons why they're doing what they're doing. And as far as Orange Shirt Day, I think it's September 30th. Everybody acknowledges residential schools. It's not so much practice here. I know it was practiced with our tribe, but other people, it just brings awareness. You wear orange on September 30th and you talk about boarding schools. And some people had programs. I know we had a program I had to be at, and we talked about boarding schools. So I'm hoping that more education and awareness that happens where I get people ask me all the time, like, we didn't know this was happening. We didn't even know, what are we doing about it today? And so there's things we need to learn from history so we don't repeat it. Does anybody else have any questions?
There's questions via Zoom that I can read out.
Okay, yeah, that would help.
Amazing. The first one is, thanks so much for sharing your work with us. We have a number of students here studying cultural resource management who might be in a position to work with NAGPRA. Do you have any advice you'd like to pass on to young professionals about how do you like to see NAGPRA work at its best?
I think NAGPRA is a great tool. NAGPRA needs to be amended. NAGPRA needs to be funded. NAGPRA has some loopholes, and there are mechanisms today where we can actually hold various dates, not exactly to NAGPRA or private museums, but they can implement their own policies in returning ancestor remains or artifacts. If I were to give any advice to anybody going into NAGPRA, protect yourself, because there are things that we as tribal people, we still believe is still here. And we believe that if you go into something wholeheartedly to protect yourself and always remind the supernatural that we're here to help them, we're learning ourselves to educate ourselves, to help them come home, and to acknowledge that. Because if you don't, you're just working from a different perspective that doesn't benefit the tribes. So when you're working with the tribes and you're working with NAGPRA, take it wholeheartedly that tribes are coming to the table, and it takes all of their resources to do so, and to know that it's a tool for them. And if we as general society don't hold the government or others accountable to repatriate items, then we're still a part of that problem. I think one thing that I dealt with a lot was promote contemporary Indigenous artists. Buy what they're asking for at the price that they're asking for, and don't buy off the black market. Don't promote, private museums or collections. And NAGPRA is that tool to start those conversations NAGPRA has a lot of work to do, but funding, they're lacking funding. That's probably what I would say. There are so many things that need to happen under NAGPRA that I think it's going to be always evolving to make it better. And I think that's what growing does. Is there another question? Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question about the organizations that established the various boarding schools. I think, if I'm correct, that some of them were religious organizations. And some of those organizations still exist. Certainly the denominations exist. And I'm wondering if any of those organizations have apologized. What has their response been to what Native peoples have revealed about how their children were treated?
So that's a great question too. One of the things that I had talked about was how the Puritans, the Quakers, and a lot of those religious, the Catholics, that's huge on my reservation. People always say maybe we should have them apologize. And sitting there watching my elders cry in their homes, seeing them pass away without an apology, is so inhumane in a way that I can't even put my finger to describe it. I think the best way to move forward is not just to heal, but to realize sometimes your own abuser will never apologize to you. And you have to realize that. And so if you're going to continuously stay in that rut that you're in and continuously think that this person is going to apologize to you, I think change behavior is the biggest thing. We need change behavior in racism, inequality, diversity. Policies need to start reflecting that. And I think that change behavior is huge. We can wait all we want for an apology, but I think change behavior is the biggest aspect of that. We can wait all we want to have reparations, and money only goes so far. We really need to start thinking outside that box and thinking, how can we heal? Trauma is so rampant that it affects tribal members day to day. And so to hear someone apologize would be great, but what does that actually do to their psyche and their healing when they need to kind of realize, hey, you know what? We need to empower ourselves. I don't know if you heard Melanie Friday on the video. That's how we went to Carlisle, was like thinking somebody's going to come save us, right? The government's going to save us and apologize. We're like, we can't wait no more. Look who this is affecting. Look at our children. Look who's dying from these diseases and these, impacts. So I think that's great. I think apologies are great, but I think change behavior through policies and education is even better. Somebody else have a question?
Another one on Zoom that I can.
Okay, yeah.
Says the U.S. government and other institutions responsible for the boarding schools have continued to be resistant to recognizing the horrors of the boarding schools. Can you speak to how much of a step forward the Indian Bordering School Initiative Memorandum from Secretary of Interior Howland is? Is it too early to tell how this will be followed through on?
Yes, so yes, I think it is too early because for the repatriation we did, it didn't just happen like, because I got told once already, right? So it's going to take the government to figure out what does that look like to themselves? What does that look like to organizing and structuring in each federally recognized tribe, how that looks? What does that look like? There's some questions I even have. I had a report here. I don't know if it'll come up. one of the things that we did was a report, and it's ground penetrating radar survey. And one of the things that they did was they took the magnetometer through the cemetery and through the parking lot, and they decided through this report how and where these children were buried. That took a lot of resources, it took a lot of funding, just for Carlisle. Imagine doing that for every federally recognized tribe. What does that look like for the budget for the Secretary of Interior? So when we, you can actually Google this and it'll come up, it's on public record. One of the things in the report, and this is the Army's report, that they had done was just talk about the history, how they use GPR, and how moving forward, what did that look like? What did it look like for tribes? This is one report for one school, and there are unknowns there. One of the things that I was trying to do was repatriate the unknowns. They were like, you need an affidavit to claim the unknowns. And so actually, after this report came out, there is actual, if you Googled Dickinson College, Carlisle, you can go and see all the unknowns actually are known. And so next year, they are gonna start repatriating a lot of the unknowns. One of the things and the horrific atrocities that have happened at Carlisle is really dark. It's really triggering. When we got there, one of the things that we went through was, and I don't have it on here, is actually getting there, knowing where the train is, and as soon as you get off, is a little old jail, and I think it's about as big as this room. And there's a dungeon under there. And there was a lot of stories from our own people where they would get there and get thrown right into the dungeon. So imagine you're a 5, 6-year-old, don't speak English, doesn't know what's going on, gets there, they're thinking they're misbehaving and just throw them in the dungeon, And so those types of things happen, along with physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse. Some of the children who went out to work were just, labor for the summer. Go stay with these farmers or this church, and you're going to be labor for that, exploited labor for that summer. The outings, they actually have documented, and it's coming about that there are children that were passed away during the outings. And so a lot of these academic tribal people have actually put in a lot of resources, and they're writing books, they're doing their own reports, they're finally getting the courage to stand up and say, this is what happened to our people. And I think really people are always like, this is what you did, Yufna, this is, and I was like, I think we were always wanting to do this, I think it was something that needed to happen. But, in the end, I feel like if we didn't keep trying to hold the government accountable, they'd still be there. Even if Canada was going through what they're going through now, maybe our people would still be there. And so trying to reconnect all of these dots and repatriate, like I said, this is just one repatriation that I did within my career. And it gets real heavy. It gets real a burdensome type of thing, because things want to go home, whether they're animate or inanimate. And in our lives, inanimate is still alive. And so those things want to come home. And so we have to start making a pathway for these things to go home to tribes. And a lot of tribes have lost that connection and that knowledge in these artifacts or ancestors. And so that in itself is a part of healing, but it's reconnecting ourselves with the stories, the knowledge, and really making awesome relationships. I had so many awesome people back east that I met that were so supportive, that were so encouraging, that were just like, you have to do this, we're going to help you, and there's times the Army would be knocking on my door like 7 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the morning, like, hey, we got something you need to talk about. And so it was this huge support system we had there. And I don't think we would have been able to do a lot of what we did if we didn't have that support. There are so many Native Americans back east that were really helpful too. Does anybody else have any questions? Yes.
Thanks for your talk and for driving through the snow. I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about how you prepared yourself and your elders and your community members before you went to Carlisle. You talked about the need to heal and make sure that everyone was grounded for this major undertaking. So I'm just curious to hear how you decided what to do and what you did.
So one of the things we did to prepare to go to Carlisle was, so even in my life, and I kind of say it in the movie, was that we've never even been to Carlisle, we just hear these stories of these horrific stories of trauma and triggering stories of Carlisle. And we were like, I knew myself, like, you saw how emotional Hubert got in the video. I was like, I can't get our elders and our youth there, and I can't get them there and have them get sick. I need to deal with this issue of luggage that they're carrying, and I need to have closure. And so there's a tribal program. It's called White Bison. White Bison deals with, it's called Mending Broken Hearts. And if you ever get a chance, take it, because what it deals with is unresolved grief. And even though it's a tribally practice grieving session for a whole week, it's real intense. That's what we went through. And if you ever get a chance, I think the founding person that made that curriculum is here in Colorado. But what tribes have done, they've started adopting it. And every chance anybody gets, they can go to it, and it's real intense. And it talks about how, through our own practices of talking and, community and shared values within a tribe. And we always just sit down and talk. And then culturally, sometimes the men all go talk and all the women talk. And then slowly we all come back together and we talk about what's bothering us, That's what I had to do for our elders and our youth. And if I didn't do that, and we went over there and they saw and connected these stories to reality, they probably would have gotten sick there. There's times when we did the training where my own employees got sick because, let's face it, Wyoming is, and maybe even just tribes all over in general, where we put on that stoic Indian, right? We're that stoic Indian where we don't show emotion, we don't even smile or laugh. And so slowly over the years, that's what we become. And so our emotions, we just like put them somewhere and hope that they don't come out. And so I didn't want to go to Carlisle and have all of these demons coming out, And so that's one thing we did to prepare. And I thought, if we don't do this and we don't do it right the first time, we're going to be, I'll be in the hospital with, so many of our different people that it's not going to be productive. So we actually went through those trainings like 3 different times throughout the year, and we were getting them ready. We were mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, financially preparing them to go on this journey. And it's something I'll probably remember my whole life. It was hard. When they told us little Plume wasn't in the grave that we thought he was in, I lost it because it was so personal to me. And I thought, okay, he's in there, so we'll bring him home. And when the Army said, no, he's not. These remains aren't the same as what he should be. And so I was like, great, now I have to tell the family. I have to be that messenger again of bad news. And so I did. I had to have courage and do this in a way that, nobody's had to do before. And I had to kind of break that trail and be like, be strong, do this, everybody's relying on you to do this. So eventually it got to the point where we healed enough to bring them home, but we need to heal our communities now. I'm going to check to see if.
Yeah, we have another question that came in.
Okay.
That's, what is the best way, in your opinion, that public historians, cultural research professionals, and others in similar fields can work and serve with and serve tribal communities that goes beyond NAGPRA Section 106 and other federal state law?
So I think one thing is go to school, get your degree, get your diplomas, because that's really helpful credentially when you're going to do anything. And it makes you more credible. It makes you come from a place of authority when you're going to do something, and people will take that into consideration, and they will say, okay, this person went to school for this, so finish school. As hard as it is, you know, if I can do it, they can do it, you know. And the other thing is just really focus on, and like they said, like other than, you know, tribal communities, we get so stuck in the fact that tribes are on reservations. There are a lot of urban Indians in cities, and they need the support. They need to know they're acknowledged. They need to know that they need to be encouraged once in a while to say, hey, you know, what you're doing is great. How can we collaborate with you? How can we work to get funding back to your tribe to do a certain project? And that's all it takes sometimes, is to people to invest a little bit of their time in learning that Native students themselves are struggling. And to live in those two worlds is really hard. I've done that myself. So just knowing what school is like, and knowing that if you know you have that support, you can get through school. But with non-tribal people, they have the ability to still help urban natives who live and work in these different cities. And they need that support just as much as people on the reservation.
I just wanted to say thank you. So mine's less of a question and more of a appreciation. I do a lot of teaching at CSU and teach on privilege and oppression, and teaching on accurate history is so much an important part of what I do. And so every time I have the opportunity to come and to listen to stories, firsthand stories of people, Indigenous folks and other groups that I also teach on, but it's incredibly important. And the ripples of knowledge that this creates are so important. So thank you for being here and telling me your story tonight.
Thank you. Thanks. There any other questions? I don't know how much more minutes we have for the presentation, but I kind of just wanted to say thank you too. Thanks to Jared, and it's not here, Frank. Coming back to CSU has made it full circle for me, because I used to come down here with my dad a lot, and even the museum. So my standing orders, my dad was a Marine, right? So my standing orders were to make sure his paperwork gets somewhere and gets digitized, because I wouldn't have been able to do this project if I didn't have a lot of his resources. And even though they're photos and it's a family tree in a way, and it's connecting all of these different tribes, you know, it's there. And I can't just have it home stuck away, sitting there, when people can learn from it. And really being able to share that story through Frank and Ed and Jared has been really surreal to me, because just like this documentary, I can't even watch it because I'm so emotional. I'm still like going through the things myself of healing. And I want to get to the point where our great grandkids are like, hey, you know, look what these guys did. They saved all of this history and all this knowledge, and we can learn from it. But at the same time, to actually make that happen has been hard. And I couldn't have done it without Frank, Jared, and the museum. So I want to thank them and everybody else here. CSU and Fort Collins was always the ancestral home of the Northern Arapaho. And we have such a beautiful history here that's being forgotten too. So I think it's going full circle of trying to come back and preserve that history.
And you've done a wonderful